In the Torah, in one place, Rosh Haşana is called on the first day of the 7th month, which is the Hebrew month of Tishrei, which is the beginning of our year. So it says, Yom Teruah Yelachem, which means you will have a day of blowing the horn. Teruah is actually a sound that comes out of the horn. So because of this, we know from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, from the Pentateuch, that we have to blow a ram's horn on this day. In another place in the Torah, it talks about this holiday as being Yom Zikaron, a day of remembrance, which means a day when God remembers his people of Israel and the whole world at large. We actually believe in our tradition that Rosh Hashanah, as a day of judgment, is not just a day of judgment for the Jewish people. We say in our liturgy that on this day, God looks at every person just like a shepherd looks at their flock and decides what to do for them for the next year. Officially, on Rosh Hashanah, you can blow any horn of a kosher animal. In our tradition, a kosher animal, as is mentioned in the book of Leviticus, is an animal that has a split hoof, which means in the foot, and also that it ruminates, that it chews its cud. For instance, a cow, or a goat, or a ram, and sheep, buffalo, for instance, deer. So any of those type of horns would be okay. But we use the ram horn specifically because it also reminds us of the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. God tells Abraham, take your son, the one that you love, Isaac, and bring him up to the mountain which I shall show you, which according to our tradition is the mountain of Moriah, the Temple Mount, and bring him as an offering. Abraham doesn't ask questions, he doesn't understand why, but he just does God's bidding. And he brings Isaac with him. And Isaac says, Father, I see you brought wood, and you brought something for the fire, but where is the lamb that is going to be the offering? And Abraham says to Isaac, God will show us the offering, my son. And Isaac looks at him and says, they walk together just as before. And finally they come to the mount, and Abraham binds Isaac to the altar and ties up his legs and his arms. That's called in Hebrew akedah. And Isaac understands at this point that he is the offering. And then he waits. And while he's waiting, he doesn't realize that Abraham has a prophecy. And God says to Abraham, do not send your hand to this lad. Don't touch him, because I know that you are God-fearing. Let him go. And Abraham takes a ram that was stuck in a thicket in the bushes. And he takes Isaac, takes him down, and puts the ram instead. The ram's horn also reminds us specifically the binding of Isaac. Another reason why we don't use a cow's horn. If you remember, you had the sin of the golden calf. And a cow would remind us of the sin of the golden calf. We don't want that. So specifically, we don't use a cow's horn on Rosh Hashanah. It says, on that day, in futuristic times, Yitaka b'shofar gadol, which means God will blow a great ram's horn. And all those who are lost in the lands of Assyria, and the ones who were pushed away into the lands of Egypt, they shall come back to the land and bow to God on the sanctified mountain of Jerusalem. So for us, the shofar also represents the final redemption, when the Jews will come back to their land, to their homeland, build themselves up as a nation, both nationally and spiritually. That also is represented in the shofar. So also on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we use the shofar. When you do blow the shofar, it vibrates, so it gives a more emotional tone to it. In the book of Amos, in the Bible, Amos says, can it be that somebody blows a shofar in the city and people are not afraid? The shofar was used, if you remember, the battle of Joshua, fighting Jericho. They blew the shofar, the ram's horn, as going around the city 7 times, and the walls trembled and fell. But as the walls trembled and fell, I'm sure the people inside the city trembled too, even before the walls fell. Maimonides, in the 12th century, the famous Jewish philosopher and legalist, he says the meaning of the shofar is wake up. It's a sound that wakes you up, because during these days, from Jewish New Year to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we want to wake up in the sense that we want to be able to change ourselves for the better. And the shofar is that wake-up call. The shofar is actually a musical instrument. Probably if there were holes here, like on a flute, you would be able to variate the tones. Every shofar actually has 2 tones. It has the low tone, which is usually used, which is when you use your full mouth, and it has a higher tone when you use a half mouth. It's a little harder to get to, but I will try. This is the full tone, as you know. That's the full tone of this shofar. Different ram's horns have slightly different tones. The longer they are, the lower the tone will be. A half tone, I'll try to get to it. So you see, it's like almost a whole octave higher. By closing my lips more, I can get to the higher tone. Some people like actually to go from the lower to the higher, but when we blow in Rosh Hashanah, we try to keep it steady, the tone steady. The truth is that since the shofar is an instrument, if you actually variate the way you blow into it, you can actually play tunes with the shofar. But we don't use it so much as a musical instrument in our tradition. But it is possible to do so, and as a child, I used to experiment with this a lot. But it definitely has a very resonating sound, and as I said, if the Yemenite shofars, which are much longer, sometimes this long, they have a very deep, like a bass sound, which also resonates even more. And I think part of the fact that it resonates is also the value of the sound of the shofar. There are basically 2 sounds in the Bible related to the ram's horn, which is called the shofar. And one of them is called, of course, the day is called Yom Teruah. Now, Teruah in Hebrew means a breaking sound, a breaking sound. Now, the question is, when you have a broken sound, how much do you break it into? So we have 2 versions of a broken sound. One of them is the 3, which is like this. Some people, like the Yemenites, they do it a little bit more dramatically. And then we have a second sound of a breaking sound, which is the 9, which sounds more like a cry. Right? It's sort of like a cry. The Talmud actually defines this, the Talmud, the book of the oral tradition, defines these two sounds as the difference between a sigh and a cry. So these two sounds represent a sigh and a cry. But then we have another sound, which is the straight sound. It's called tekiah, tokea, which means that to blow the horn. It's a long sound. So you have the long sound. The way we do it is first we blow a long sound, then we blow the two broken sounds, the sigh and the cry, and then the long sound again. And because we're not sure if it's supposed to be the sigh or the cry, then we blow another long sound, the 3 broken sound, another long sound, and then the third time, a long sound, the 9 broken sound, and then the long sound. These are the order of the way we blow it, the shofar, on the day of New Year, on Rosh Haşana. You can understand this symbolically as the process of change. In Hebrew, teshuvah, penitence. Returning, and returning means returning to yourself. Because God creates human beings a tabula rasa. But what we bring upon ourselves is for good or for bad. The first thing we find, a person starts as a clean slate. That's the long sound. Everything's fine. And then as we grow up and we have friends, and friends influence us a lot, especially teenagers are very impressionable. And then you start hanging around with people because you want to be accepted, and these people do things that you didn't learn from your parents, but they're good people in the end. They didn't mean to do anything bad. But then you wonder why you're hanging around with these people who are influencing you the wrong way. So that's called the sigh. But these are my friends, what can I do? And then you start hanging around with people which do things a little bit more that you would expect. And then one day you wake up in the morning, wonder, how did I get into this situation? I don't want to be here. That's called the cry. That's the second part of the process. When you actually realize, I don't want to be here. And at that moment, you have the ability to make the change, because we need that wake-up call, which is called the shofar, to help us make that change. Because change is the hardest thing in human condition. We like habits. It's just like we get up in the morning and wash our face and brush our teeth. We want everything to be habit, the same as it was. And breaking out of habits is the hardest thing to do. This is our shofar, and these are the sounds that we blow. The sound, the long sound, which I called before, the tekiah goes like this. That's the long sound. The sigh, as I said, goes like this. Or a little more dramatically. And then, of course, the cry goes like this. Or some people do it a little bit, which I don't. And then, of course, the final tekiah. When we are finished all the 30 blows, we have what's called the long tekiah. Tekiah gdola, the great blow. And the great blow is very long. What is the symbolism of the great blow? Well, first of all, it says in Isaiah, as I mentioned before, on that day, God will blow with a great shofar, a great ram's horn, and call all the people back to the land of Israel, all the people of Israel. So that has to be a very long blow. But this also relates to Exodus chapter 20, which is God's revelation at Sinai, where he says the Decalogue, what we call the Ten Commandments, to the people of Israel. And in that, right before it mentions the Decalogue, it says that God spoke to the Jewish people, Kol Gadol Velo Yasaf, a great voice that never stopped. That voice is constantly continuing. There are many people try to understand, in what sense is it continuing? As Jews, we believe that when we study the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, we are listening to that voice talking to us from generation to generation. That's called Tiki'a Gedola, the long blow. It has to stop because the wind in our lungs stops at a certain point, but it's to remind us that it continues from generation to generation. Since not everybody has their own shofar, one person blows the shofar for the congregation. In Jewish law, when you hear the shofar, that is the obligation. Of course, the person blowing is also hearing the shofar. The obligation actually is not to blow the shofar, it's to listen to the shofar, the sound of the shofar.
Oj menula už zema, snidu ljodu že nema. Oj nema, snidu ljodu že nema. Njudom svite uže cvitut, vijuvci trave uže pasut. Oj pasut, vijuvci trave uže pasut.
Почалося чабанське літо, яке триває з травня по вересень. Чабани або пастухи повели отари на високогірні полонини. Звідси відкриваються неймовірні пейзажі. Сьогодні помандруємо і ми там, де гори і полонини, і дізнаємось про приготування брензи. Незалежно від повітряних явищ і взагалі погоди, вівчарі встають дуже рано. Робочий день починається о 5 годині ранку. Виганяють з кошари овець на доїння. Потім один вівчар заганяє овець, інші доять. Процес доїння триває 1 годину і половину або й 2 години і відбувається тричі на день. Зносять молоко і, попоївши, кожний виганяє свою маржену на своє пасовисько. Справа не з легких, потребує спеціальних умінь. Приготування брензи – це справжнє мистецтво. З першого овечого молока роблять сир. Залишки відігрівають на воду. Спочатку свіже овече молоко зливають і проціджують у великі дерев'яні чани путери. Після того суміш відігрівають на вогні, аби склягалася. Доводять до температури приблизно рівної ті, що була при доїнні, та додають до нього трохи клягу. Це спеціальний фермент, його роблять з висушеного шлуночка теляти або ягняти. Все кілька разів старанно перемішують. Путери ставлять біля вогню і помішують родину колотівкою, саморобною дерев'яною палецею із закрутками на кінці. У чанах з'являються згустки сиру, там їх і зліплюють докупи руками. Проціджують і зібраний сир, великий будь підвішують, щоб стікали.
Сирити його добре, аби не було дзару. І 10 минут кладу цедело, його вішаю там, має урду.
Ще один вид овечого сиру вурду роблять з молока, яке залишається в казані після приготування сиру. Його переливають у металевий казан, додають трохи свіжого молока і ставлять на вогонь. Так народжується ще один смачний сирний продукт – вурда, другий сир. Вівчарство – одна з найдавніших професій в 3 селах долини Рускова, повіт Марамуреш – Поляне, Кривей, Русково, яка збереглася до сьогоднішніх днів. Батько навчав сина, дідо онука, і так з покоління в покоління передавалися секрети цієї професії. Кажуть, що вівчарство – це заняття для душі і улюблену справу.